Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. And today I have a very special guest, Dr. Eric Helms. So if you aren't familiar with him, he has a Bachelor's of Science in Fitness and Wellness, a Master's in Exercise Science, a second Master's in Sports Nutrition, and a PhD in Strength and Conditioning. He has published multiple peer-reviewed articles in exercise science and nutrition journals. He's a coach at 3D writer at Mass, and co-host of the Iron Culture podcast. So Eric, thank you for coming on and super excited to have you.
No, it's a privilege to be on. Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate the introduction.
Yeah, like I said, a lot of people have. I was excited to get you on here. I've looked up to you for a while now. I love Iron Culture, one of my favorite podcasts. And then obviously I try to promote Mass as much as I can because I really think that that's a just invaluable resource in the fitness industry. So again, really appreciate all the work you've done. So for you, just to kind of maybe give the audience who isn't super familiar with you, do you just kind of want to give them a brief background of your, how you maybe got into training and nutrition and whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I got bit by the iron bug. I guess it would have been '04. So I was in my early 20s. I guess I would have been 21 when I first started lifting. I was still in the Air Force. And yeah, I was going through a relatively rough patch in my life. I guess at that time, based upon my limited life experience, it felt like one, that's for sure. And I needed an outlet, and that became lifting. It started relatively, I'd say, it leaned a little masochistic, but it became something positive for me, and I really just fell in love with the constant ability to find a way to progress. So I was always very interested in both getting stronger and getting bigger. And I did my first competition in '06. I competed in an unsanctioned push-pull with the local YMCA where I was a trainer. And then the next year I did my first bodybuilding season. And if you fast forward to today, I've done, 20 plus powerlifting and weightlifting meets, a couple of strongman events, and I've competed in, I want to say, 4 bodybuilding seasons with at least, between 2 to 5 shows per season. So I'm still just as much of a meathead as I always have been. I love competing. I love the process of improvement, and that's eventually what I transitioned my career to be. I started as a personal trainer, and then I wanted to work with strength and physique athletes. And then so I went from, athlete to trainer to bodybuilding coach. And then in 2009, I hooked up with the rest of the Team 3DMJ crew. That's, at the time was just Jeff Alberts, Alberto Nunez, and Brad Loomis, and we've since expanded the team pretty substantially. And now our whole mission statement is to try to provide sustainable pathways to performance improvement for the drug-free lifting community. And I've become kind of like the chief science officer of that crew, and that's led to Mass, like you brought up. Thank you very much, and it's also led to my academic career. So I've been in New Zealand for the last 10 years, pursuing that second master's and then my PhD, and now I'm a research fellow at the Auckland University of Technology here in New Zealand, where I mentor master's and PhD students who have a similar kind of muscle nerdy interest, and that's what I spend my time doing. I don't do quite as much coaching anymore, but I do act as a the advisor to our coaching staff to make sure they're up to date. And I try to act as a science communicator, doing things like this, so people understand, that the best approaches and how to get to their goals, and with the least pain and the best profit, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I guess for you, what kind of sparked the more like academic, like kind of nerdier side of things? Was that always something that you found interest in, or was there just kind of along the way you found a little more interest in that? Or yeah, what did that look like?
I think I'm somewhat of a natural skeptic. I think it is just the way I think about things. I want to understand how they work. I don't really buy into things unless I have a cohesive narrative and understanding of why it's supposed to be that way. So I was, from a very early stage, very interested in optimizing things. I was your typical neurotic lifter, who wanted to do things perfectly and make as much gains as possible type of deal. And fortunately, I matured from that perspective, which ultimately, does more harm than good for most people. And, became a lot more holistic and looking at things from a much more individualized and big picture perspective. But the fascination with the science definitely grew. And I found I was just as interested in the process of training as the process of what are the adaptations to training and nutrition, and how do things operate, and where's the room to improve, and how do we answer all these lingering questions that we don't have access to. So I sort of started with simply being a consumer and a follower of evidence-based content and primary research. And eventually I decided I wanted to give back, which is ultimately what research is. To do it, it's a very time-intensive process. If you want to answer definitively a research question, that's your career. That'll take you a decade to do. And there's not like there's a lot of money in research, at least in our field. So I felt I'd gotten so much out of lifting and from the community that I wanted to give back. So I also wanted to learn more about it. And I think there's only so far you can go if you're not actively involved in the primary research process with understanding how to interpret research and understanding its limitations. So actually getting my hands in the lab per se and conducting research was something that was a natural next step. And once I kind of developed the self-efficacy where I thought, hey, I'm probably capable enough to do research-based degrees. That's what eventually led me out here, and I'm still loving it. And honestly, I think the mentoring process of helping other people walk the same path I started, a decade ago is something I really enjoy now, working with the students here at AUT.
Awesome. Yeah. Anytime I have somebody that is actively in the research, I just, I always tell them, man, I don't know how you guys do it. Cause like you said, there is so much that goes into it, and that takes, forever. The process takes forever. And so really appreciate what you guys do and pushing, this field forward, because it is super helpful. For you, who were some of your people that you looked up to? Cause you kind of mentioned you got into it in 2004, and obviously there wasn't this abundance of knowledge, people in the field, or at least widely available, right? So for you, who are some people that you kind of looked up to and maybe still do look up to in this field?
Yeah. So my kind of gateway drug into evidence-based or a science-based approach was Lane Norton. For those who remember, way back before social media, there was bodybuilding.com forums, and there was this small video series called Inside the Life of a Natural Bodybuilder, where it was multiple episodes of Lane Norton talking about his mid-2000s contest preps and how he's using a more science-based approach. And I think at the time he was in the midst of his PhD. And he was, generally talking about what were revolutionary concepts at the time, focusing on energy balance and macronutrient distributions rather than strict food lists, having a more of a focus on progressive overload and training, getting away from some of the more voodoo-esque kind of traditions in peak week that really didn't make sense from a physiological perspective, or leaned too much on physiological supposition rather than empirical evidence. And then from there, I learned about Joe Klemczewski, who was basically Lane's coach and was the original progenitor of a not only online coaching, but of an evidence-based approach to bodybuilding. And he's someone I still work with today and look up to highly and greatly respect. And it's a true joy that I look back at where I started, lifting weights in 2004, and then hearing about and going to one of Dr. Joe's, peaking conferences. I was either 2009 or 2010. And then now today, I collaborate with him in a number of different areas, and we have some organizations together that we collaborate on and try to improve the field. So he's probably a great example of someone who has influenced me and continues to influence me to this day. But certainly there were many who influenced me. I think when you start in this space, you begin with listening to other people who are good at digesting research and communicating it well. Alan Aragon comes to mind as someone who very early on, obviously he was the first person in our space to do a research review. So, things like Mass and James Krieger's Weightology. Well, James Krieger's also been around forever. His original articles were very inspirational to me. So those are some examples of people. The space has definitely changed over time. And I've become much more of a producer rather than consumer of that content. So it gives you a different perspective as time goes on. And I've also gotten involved with academia. So there's some people who are purely just producing science, so that those other people I mentioned earlier, and I include myself in there, then communicate it. And then some of the people who communicate it are also researchers. Like, for example, for myself, but not always, and then you have people who kind of sit purely in the communication side of it, or just I will then, take what you've communicated and use it in my practice. So it's an interesting little ecosystem there. And I think I have a lot of respect for people in all parts of it if they're, doing it to the best of their capability.
Yeah, it's probably hard to at least do all three of those, the ones that you mentioned, be the one that, you do the research and then you obviously give it out to, like probably like more like coaches and then actually apply that. There's kind of like you said that ecosystem there with it. I think it's probably hard to do all three, but you said you still do some coaching, correct?
I do, yeah. And at the peak where I was doing all three, I want to say around 2014, I was starting my PhD. I had just finished my master's and published some of my first research. I was involved in actively conducting research, and I still had like 30 to 40 clients through 3DMJ online. And I was also, getting more and more starting around that time, being a science communicator. And it is a great way to learn very quickly, to understand the nuances from all sides of the same, set of information, and also a great way to have no free time and burnout. So I think you have to partition things. So these days I have like 5 clients at most at any given time. And they're often people I've been working with for years, so I'm still working with my very first powerlifting client, for my very first competitive powerlifting client, who people have probably heard of, Bryce Lewis, if you're in the powerlifting space. And then I've got a handful of other people who I've been working with. I don't think any of them for less than a couple of years, so yeah.
So basically to work with you, you basically have to have been in the grandfathered in essentially at this point.
Yeah, typically there's someone who I have a personal connection with, and it just came up, but I don't like have my quote unquote flag up at 3D Muscle Journey. I'm not one of the coaches who's actively taking on clients like Brian, Jeff, Brad, Alberto, so yeah.
Awesome. And then for you, is there any like research coming up that you are going to be partaking in? Is there anything that, might be coming out soon that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, so we actually started in 2019 a weight gain study where we were going to compare different rates of weight gain to see which ones seem to have the best combination of minimizing gains in adiposity or fat mass, maximizing gains in fat-free mass, and increasing strength. It's an 8-week study. We were just trying to get double-digit numbers in each group. We basically had 3 groups. We had a maintenance group, a small surplus group, and a larger surplus group. And then we were also going to do some analyses that kind of looked at the group as a whole. And I don't know if you heard of anything that's happened in the couple of years since 2019. I don't know if you've heard of COVID.
No, I haven't heard anything.
If your listeners are familiar with that. Yeah, apparently it didn't affect many people, but no, that was a huge impediment. So what was planned to be finished in 2020 is now just getting finished now.
Wow.
So and with about 2/3 of the sample size we'd hope to have. So it's getting done. We're just going to start on analysis very soon. We're just got a few little bits of data entry to do and summarizing to get in a nice format to get analyzed. But that's probably the next thing on the horizon. And besides that, I've got PhD students coming out next year, and current master's students right now who are collecting some data. So we've got some projects related to carbohydrate loading for physique performance. So specifically how that impacts appearance. That's being done by my student Kai Homer, who's out here from Perth. Now he's hopped the pond over to New Zealand. So he's going to be doing some very cool research pretty soon there. Yeah, a number of my other PhD students are getting toward the end of their data collections. There'll be more information coming out on weight cutting from Kedrick Kwan, on intra microcycle recovery using power days from Colby Sousa. And also there's more and more research coming out on how to prescribe resistance training effectively for strength and power adaptations from Ivan Jukic, and protocols to reduce the effects or the negative effects of menstrual cycle on resistance training adaptations from Kim Santa Barbara, another one of my PhD students. There's a lot of cool stuff going on.
Yeah.
Also, Sohee Lee, people have probably heard about. She's about to start data collection comparing circuit training versus traditional resistance training in women to see what kind of different adaptations and acceptance there is in women. So lots of cool stuff coming out, and it's just a privilege to be a part of it all.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know with the menstrual cycle, it seems like a lot of stuff's been coming out a lot more lately on that type of stuff in terms of like how to program during the menstrual cycle. For your, I'm really curious on the weight gain one. I think that's going to be a really cool one because I feel like there's not a lot of research out on that currently, and I think it will definitely be super helpful to kind of figure out, what is a good amount there. What is kind of like the general consensus right now on that, and what's maybe your hypothesis going into this study?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to really nail things down to how quickly you should gain weight when by far the variable that's going to have the largest impact on how effective you're able to put on muscle mass is your training age, and then how effective your resistance training program is. And there is such a large difference between individuals with what type of response they can get to different types of training programs, or just inter-individual differences, that I think we really need to start unpacking like what is true inter-individual variability, can it be predicted, and what factors impact it from a training perspective, and then how does that interact with nutrition. Because when you have, say, 30 people who are all on a standardized weight training program, even if the nutrition does move the needle a little bit, if the program is great for some people and terrible for others, that will create some noise in the data. So I think right now we have some broad brushstrokes that we can provide. There's not like we don't have any data. There was a study by Garth that was done about a decade ago. Tinsley and colleagues recently did a similar analysis to what we're trying to put out, and they kind of had an analysis of 500 calories with a large amount of variability is where you got the most fat-free mass for the least amount of fat mass, but that's also tied to the population. So sometimes when you look at training protocols and more well-trained lifters, it's very challenging to have that kind of rate of gain, and you also see that anecdotally. So kind of the general consensus is somewhere between like a 1 to 2% of body mass gain per month, scaled down in speed for the more the closer you are to your theoretical genetic ceiling, is probably more appropriate. But that can be heavily changed by how effective your training is and other factors that are unrelated to size of the surplus.
Yeah, that's when it comes to that, I feel like that's a very common question, like, oh, I need to be in a surplus, but it's like people will forget about the training. And like you said, that is such an important aspect of it. It's like, I think we forget how important the training aspect is when it comes to building muscle. Like, cause I think, people think, hey, like, nutrition is very important, but I feel like it's gotten taken too far lately to where it's like people forget about the training aspect and just how important that aspect of it is in terms of building muscle. Cause it's like, that's going to send that signal to build muscle. So if that's off, it's like, no matter what you do nutrition wise, it really doesn't matter if that's off.
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at it is if you are on a program that is sufficient to induce hypertrophy, but it's actually pretty shitty compared to other programs, you're going to be limited by how much muscle you can gain, and you can't like force feed that. That's just not the way it works. So, if you were to take a shitty program where you're in a small surplus versus a large surplus, you might have already maxed out the rate of gains you can get with that first one. And we don't have any evidence to think that really large surpluses and like provide some kind of additive stimulus for muscle gain for programs. I think more so it's probably true just based on understanding mechanisms and how they work rather than having direct evidence, which is a bit of a limitation to the statement I'm about to make, is that you can undereat on a program that is effective enough to produce a quick, a relatively rapid gain in muscle mass. But you can't do the opposite of taking a shitty program and eating more to hopefully make it better. So because it's a nice way that I like to describe it is that nutrition is permissive to muscle gain rather than directly causative. If you put someone into a calorie surplus without weight training, their lean body mass might go up, but their muscle mass isn't going up very much. Maybe in response to if they maintain a certain level of activity, but they weigh more, just carrying around heavy body mass to some slight degree. Because we do see slightly higher levels of muscle mass in people with higher activity, but it's nothing compared to progressive resistance training studies.
Cool. Yeah. And I think that I'm really looking forward to that study because I think that will really help a lot of people out. But also with that, what's kind of like the the sample size of how many participants are you going to have in this? And you said it's 8 weeks, I think you said.
It's around 20 in total. Yeah, it's
Okay.
an 8-week study with around 20 in total. And there was a threshold for strength of being able to squat at least 1.5 times body weight, bench body weight for men, and then kind of like a 0.25 down for women in both of those. Training full body with an emphasis on hypertrophy 3 times a week, main lifts or the bench and the squat, and then a fair amount of dumbbell and cable accessory work. So it'll tell us about, like intermediates.
Right.
It's not going to answer the question for someone who's like, hey, I'm a WNBF pro looking to take a 2-year off season. Should I just take a 1 year and gain faster? But I think it is adding some information to a relatively uninformed space. And arguably, you could also say that the vast majority of people who are thinking about like an evidence-based informed approach to resistance training are somewhere in the intermediate phase, so.
Right. And yeah, that's cool. Obviously having like the certain, how much they can squat, obviously, like you said, it's going to make sure that those people are a little bit more, like you said, intermediate and whatnot. So it's not like a beginner, because obviously, like you said, that's going to change, how much muscle they can build and whatnot there. Cool. Yeah. Really looking forward to that study coming out. I think that will be, like I said, super informative. And like you said, we'll just continue to progress that area. So one question I did want to have before we moved on to the main topic was, what's your current training and nutrition like? Like I said, I always like to find out what people are currently doing. And like I said off air, I actually don't know what you're currently doing right now. I know you were competing in bodybuilding for a period of time. I don't know if you're done powerlifting, but yeah, curious to hear about where you're at there with that.
Yeah, if people were listening earlier to the different types of competitions I've done, I do jump around. That I am kind of like a multi-sport strength / physique athlete. So that's a very understandable. And it's not like I have an Instagram profile of an influencer who's like, what's up, fam? Here's what I did today. Like it's, hey, I was on this podcast recently. Please leave the platform and go listen to that. And Instagram's like, oh, algorithm doesn't like that.
Yep.
You get 10 likes. So anyway, and I used to share on my stories my training, but I don't do it anymore. Just haven't really wanted to for whatever reason. So anyway, the last powerlifting competition I did was 2021, and I was actually leading up to New Zealand Nationals, but unfortunately, the big lockdown we had here was like 3 days before Nationals. So I ended up just peaking and competing, quote unquote, in my garage, with myself. And that was the first time I squatted 500 pounds or 227.5. And I hit a PR bench squat and total. I was really pleased with it. Didn't get to do it in competition, but it was good to see that my intrinsic motivation served me well. So I had a nice little run with powerlifting in 2021. In 2020, I had a nice run with weightlifting. And then in 2019, I also had a foray into strongman after my bodybuilding season, my last bodybuilding season, 2019. And in 2020, I also did a Highland Games competition and weightlifting and powerlifting. So I did like 4 different sports. It was a lot of fun. So anyway, now I'm actually focused on my next competitive season in natural bodybuilding, which is going to be next year, 2023. So I'm in a very very bodybuilding focused phase right now. I recently just came off a mini cut to bring my weight down, or really my body fat down to something to give me a little more runway to gain. So I'm hanging around 94 kilos. And if the Americans out there want to know what that is, that's like 206, 207 on average, I think, if I do my math right. And that's I just want to slowly maybe gain another 2 to 3 pounds over the next, say, 5 months. And then I'll bring my weight down and kind of do like a gaintaining phase before then I start dieting sometime in March of next year to try to make it all the way through WNBF World. So my training right now is 5 days a week. And every session is starting with a focus on what I perceive my weak points are in my physique, or at least the points in my physique that would benefit from growth more than others to enhance my overall symmetry. I don't think I actually have like a small back or small shoulders, but I think because I have a relatively narrow frame, and people often downplay just how important your skeletal structure is. Like I have relatively narrow clavicles, a small rib cage. I can never have big enough lats and delts for just my physique. So, and you rarely hear that. Like, it's like, number 6 did well, but back was too big. Like, that's not a thing, right? So So right now, every one of my sessions starts with 4 sets of shoulders and then 4 sets of back. And then I'm also trying to bring up my calves a little bit. That's probably the one weakest point in my lower body. So then I do 4 sets of calves. So I'm doing like 20 sets on all 3 of those body parts to across the week. And then I just kind of do basically the maintenance dose of what I think will be sufficient to maintain or maybe even make a little bit of progress for everything else. So yeah, most of my training is based around dumbbells and cables at the moment, with some other barbell based movements. Like I do bench and I do some RDLs depending on the phase of training right now. But I don't actually have like a competition squat, bench, or deadlift in my training right now, so it's very bodybuilding focused.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really cool to hear how you've kind of gone in and out of different sports. While they're all, fairly similar, they are different enough, especially as you get as advanced as you are, right? There's definitely it can just get very challenging, I feel like, to program. Was there anything that you found was challenging to like transition back and forth to any of them, or do you just kind of have the programming down to where you made that transition as easy as possible?
The most important piece for me to figuring out how to smooth these transitions without losing progress in one sport versus the other is figuring out what was the minimum dose I needed to maintain a certain level of proficiency in each. So basically, when I'm in a powerlifting phase, how much accessory work do I need so I don't lose size on any of the things that aren't effectively trained by the powerlifting movements I normally do? How many rows and lat pull downs and bicep curls do I need to be doing? How many sets of calf raises? How many sets of leg curls and leg extensions do I need for the rec fem and the hamstring groups, right? And so from having a lot of years of experience experimenting with that, I have a good idea of that. Also, having gone through injury where I couldn't squat or deadlift for a while back, 5 years or so ago, and coming back and then experimenting with low volumes on those movements to see what I needed to maintain that. I realized I need a very, very low dose of relatively high intensity work, like 1 or 2 singles a week at a 6 to 8 RPE. So we're talking with 85 to 90, 91, 92% of 1RM, something I could do on a bad day. That's definitely enough to keep the vast majority of your strength, especially if you're maintaining size and you're focusing on something else. I found the hardest phases were actually training for Olympic lifting while doing these other things, because it requires such a large time commitment to technique improvement for someone who's a bad Olympic lifter, that it does eat into just the time availability you have for heavy squats and then heavy bench press and sumo deadlift, which is the way I pull, and then all the accessory work. So that was probably by far the most challenging, because that just takes time, and you always could benefit from doing more from this kind of almost pure technical work. And that training has very little transfer to improving squat, bench, deadlift, or overall size. Me doing drop snatches with 40 kilos isn't going to do a whole lot when I can squat 227 kilos or bench 150, 155 kilos. So that was probably the most challenging thing to balance. And that was why my goal in 2020 was to compete in 4 different strength sports, was to really try to give myself that challenge to see if I could figure it out.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's really cool. Again, I think it's great that you're switching it out, because I feel like a lot of times people will just be like, hey, you got to decide one or the other. What out of those ones, which one? So again, you're going back to bodybuilding. It sounds like I have a couple more questions on that, but for you, is that kind of the one that you're going to maybe start to focus on a little bit more, or are you still going to kind of try to, do some powerlifting and whatnot as well moving forward?
Yeah, I think weightlifting for me, yeah, like if you look at the phases where people, like, the requirements to be good at a given sport are typically associated with a certain biological and or training age. And if you look at where people peak in weightlifting, it's typically in their 20s. If you look at people where they peak in powerlifting, it's typically in their 30s. Granted, there's huge individual variability on those numbers. And then if you look at natural bodybuilding, there's no direct studies on this, but I've always noticed, as someone who's been to WNBF Worlds multiple times and many, many pro shows, that almost like half the people on stage are in their 40s. They've had that much quote unquote time under tension. So, the things that people perceive as being the most important factors for some of these sports, like, oh, it's your testosterone production. It's not actually it. And even if like I wanted to pursue doing weightlifting and people like, oh, your power production's lower, like I still could get stronger and better, even though like my ceiling's coming down because I'm so far from my potential ceiling. Like if I started weightlifting at 10 years old, if you look at my powerlifting numbers, you'd expect me to be able to like snatch 100, 110, clean and jerk 140, 150. I got nowhere near those. Like the best snatch I ever did was in the low 80s, and my best clean and jerk was like 110. And the issue is not power for me, although it's not great. It has been mobility, and that is something that is not that modifiable. And I put in a lot of hard hours, and it's only gotten harder as I've gotten older. So like the shoulder mobility is something that has been an intense barrier for weightlifting. So I think I took that as far as I care to, and I no longer enjoy that to the same degree. So I don't think I'll ever be getting into competitive weightlifting again, to be honest. And because strongman has such a huge overhead focus, I don't think I will there as much. But powerlifting and bodybuilding, I'll keep doing them as long as my body allows. And bodybuilding is easily the more forgivable of the two. So I predict there will probably be some point in maybe my 50s where, like the squat, bench, and deadlift are just not super forgiving on my body or worth it, and I may not be competitive powerlifter anymore, but I will still be training to get stronger on whatever lifts I have that I can do comfortably and safely. So I think I'll probably be bodybuilding for till the end. I'll probably die in the gym.
I love it. Yeah, and that, like you said, I think that bodybuilding is a little bit more forgiving in terms of the exercise selection and things like that. Like you said, you definitely see, like you said, a lot of people in their 40s and 50s doing it. So for you, nutrition wise, I guess let's take the training and nutrition wise. Is there anything for you that you might, because I know last time, from what I remember, when you prepped for your last bodybuilding show, I think you did more of like a intuitive approach to nutrition. Is that something that you're going to do again? And is there anything like from a training aspect that you have kind of like changed your mind on that you might try to like switch around this time around as well?
Yeah, 2019 was easily my most successful season, and I learned a lot. And I think a lot of things worked well together. That was the first time after trialing in the off season that I used basically a low volume per body part per session, but high frequency approach. So I'm training most muscle groups each day, on a 5-day to 6-day split. That's what I did during my prep. And that's also what I'm doing currently in the off season, like I described. That was really, really good for prep, because if I didn't have it for a given day, it just didn't matter that much. Like you ask any competitive bodybuilder, the hardest thing to do is get through a full leg day when you're 6 weeks out. Yeah. Like that feels like death, and you never get to fully avoid feeling like death when you're deep into a prep and shredded and only have like, 10 times your body weight in calories or whatever. But certainly getting it together for 3 sets of leg press and then moving on to like flies is a lot easier mentally and physically than having to get through 10, 3 sets of leg press after squats, and then you got RDLs, and then you got like extension leg curl. So I will definitely be keeping that same structure for training in spirit, if you will, even if there's slight adjustments. And then on the nutrition side of it, yeah, I found that it was really successful. Ultimately, I just looked at, am I maintaining performance? Am I looking better? And am I reaching my goal, rate of weight loss? And since I've been, doing this thing for damn near 2 decades now, do I really need to track my meals, or just do I know how to eat in such a way to produce the appropriate deficit and maintain the appropriate spread of macronutrients? And at a certain point in prep, I think after the first 3 or 4 months, I did start tracking just protein and calories, just because at a certain point when you're trying to, create a deficit and eat a low amount of calories, small deviations can erase a relatively small deficit. So, I mean, I did have a pushing phase where my average calories were like 1,600 for a bit, like 3 or 4 weeks. So, like if you kind of eyeball it a little bit, when you could have like a 700 calorie deficit early on. I wasn't trying for a 700 calorie deficit at that point. I'd probably be a bad thing at that stage. When you're lean, trying to get shredded and being in a deficit, So being relatively precise at that time served me. So I got a little more tracky as I got deeper. Probably some from just a little bit of fear as well.
Yeah.
And just wanted to make sure I dotted my I's and crossed my T's. So I will probably do something similar to that as well. I also work with Berto, so it depends on how much information does he feel like he needs to better guide me. He's been kind of a second eye for my preps since since 09, since my second prep. So yeah.
Awesome. And he's doing something similar right now, right? Where he's not, from my understanding, he wasn't doing track. Maybe he switched over as he's getting a little bit leaner, but I thought he was kind of doing the same thing as well.
Yeah, there's definitely an intuitive approach to what he's doing, and he adjusts it up or down based upon how he feels on a given day. And he'll readily tell you that this isn't something that a lot of people can do without a fair amount of experience. So I think that's just an important caveat. It's not like, oh, this is a better approach. It's not like method A or method B. I think there's a certain, like, you must be this tall to enter kind of thing. And you also need to be someone who can manage your own neuroticism. Like, there's a lot of bodybuilders who probably could do this, but it would just freak them out too much. And if they just don't have the personality for it and the experience, then they probably could try it, but it would just create more stress. So I'm just someone who, that prospect, and I'm like, I don't want to be that person. Like, I want to be able to be a little more resilient to that stuff and not be operating out of fear. And I didn't even make it all the way through. Like I said, I started tracking just because I got a little nervous about it, because anxiety goes up during prep no matter how you dice it. But yeah, I see that as something to work on moving forward. And if you talk to a lot of like the old school guys, or just like an M1 or M2 competitor, been doing it for a long time, or a pro who's been doing it for a long time, like, they don't necessarily need to enter every meal into like macro factor to track their food. Like, they know what their macros are and what their energy content is, and they know how much cardio they do at different stages and all that. And that was also kind of before the quote unquote if fit your macros phase. People had very structured meal plans, and they knew what the energy content was. And if you needed to cut calories, you eat less of a portion size of your carb or fat. That easy, So it's really nothing revolutionary in my opinion. It just is contrary to what you see a lot of people doing in this space and how they quantify things and talk about it, especially in like evidence-based bodybuilding.
Yeah, like you said, it's definitely not like that's better or anything. It's like you said, and definitely as you get leaner, that likely isn't a great strategy for a lot of people. I think you definitely need to have that. You need to put in the reps probably to get to that point, because it is, I think if you just kind of go off feel, if you don't have a good experience dieting, you're definitely going to make that a very tough process. And I think this is probably a good time to transition into the body fat set point, because that kind of goes hand in hand with that. And this was kind of the main reason why one of the main things I wanted to talk to you about was body fat set point. So like I said, I've never had anybody on here to chat about this. So I guess basically, what is it? And I know there's different models that we've kind of gone through, and it seems like there's one that you think is probably the best right now.
Yeah, I think more importantly than what I think it's where the current theoretical basis is supported by the most evidence. And like, if you were to ask people who do research in this field, which I do research associated with it, I think it's important to point out that I would describe myself as a sports scientist, just focused on physique and strength sport. And since the strength sports I'm interested are weight class restricted and physique sport requires you to get shredded, that means I'm familiar with and I conduct adjacent research to like similar stuff in this. But if you were to talk to people who are studying obesity, metabolic syndrome, metabolic adaptation, adaptive thermogenesis, and adaptive responses to weight loss, and modeling these types of things, this would probably be the model that they would say this is what is what fits with what we see in all the research. So anyway, that's a little seed that I'm going to plant. And you're like, but what model is it, Eric? Well, don't worry, I'll tell you eventually. But you're probably familiar, if you've been hanging out in the evidence-based space, with the concept of a body fat set point. And people talk about it with kind of hazy definitions. And the way people describe it actually matches up with the first model that was developed in like 1952, I think, or 50. I can't remember exactly what. And that's called the lipostatic model. And that is a body fat set point, meaning that the model, which I will point out is not accurate, but it's semi-accurate enough that it made sense in the 50s before the obesity epidemic, that there's a given point that each person has of where their body likes to hang out at a certain level of adiposity, a certain weight or body fat level is defended. So when you gain weight, there are behavioral and physiological adaptations that occur that encourage loss weight or weight loss, excuse me, back to that quote unquote set point, and the opposite if you get below. If you diet, there's behavioral and physiological adaptations that drive you up towards it. So gain weight, you get less hungry, you burn more calories. Lose weight, you get more hungry and burn fewer calories. So it drives you back towards that singular point. And in 1950 or so, we did not yet have the mechanisms, but we knew this seemed to be happening. We looked at animal models and we looked at people, right? We looked at these experimental studies. They specifically hypothesized that there's some signal that is being sent from the brain to the body that is indicating our current level of adiposity. And it wouldn't be till like 4 decades later that what seemed to be that signal was discovered, and that's the hormone leptin that people have probably heard of, maybe not. And leptin does exactly that. It's produced primarily, although it's not only produced by adipose tissue, it's also produced in the gut, and there's receptors throughout the body. But when we first started looking at this, the major discoveries were, hey, adipose tissue secretes leptin, and the more adipose tissue you have, the higher your circulating leptins will be, circulating leptin levels will be. The lower your adipose tissue levels are the opposite, and it has an effect on the hypothalamus in the brain, which governs behavior and changes our energy expenditure. The hypothalamus is basically where all the metabolic magic happens, and that can influence whether you're burning more calories, burning less calories, whether you're hungrier, or whether you're really satiated. It can also have an impact on, there's the hypogonadal axis. So there's multiple, like there's the HPG and HPA axis. The H in all of those is the hypothalamus, right? So if you are in a state of very low body fat or very high body fat, that can have an impact on both, all these different axes and physiological function in our body. When we look at studies on dieting individuals or athletes in a state of low energy availability, it all comes back to that hypothalamic action. So anyway, the problem is that after leptin was discovered, it didn't operate exactly the way that first lipostatic set point model suggested. In fact, it really only seemed to be effective at defending against weight loss, because now we're in the 90s, right? The obesity epidemic is in full swing, and contrary to the original suppositions, once leptin was discovered, we thought, oh, well, maybe people with obesity have a deficiency in leptin. Their leptin levels are really low. It's actually the exact opposite of that. In common forms of obesity, people have very high levels of leptin, and that seemed to be insufficient to prevent further weight gain. And this seems to be a relatively unique thing in humans, because when you look at animal models, they're actually very effective at defending against weight gain and weight loss. And this comes down to selection pressures from an evolutionary biology perspective. So if you think about a rodent, that's a prey animal. If they get juicier and heavier, they're more likely to be eaten, and then they will not pass on their DNA, and that's a threat to survival. So defending weight gain makes a lot of sense. Likewise, though, starvation, ice ages, famine, these things affect all species, especially all species of mammals. So rodents are also very good at defending against weight loss. They're just very good at actually having something that looks a little more akin to a set point. They're the point at which they defend weight gain and the point at which they defend weight loss, they're a lot closer together. That doesn't seem to be the case in humans. Humans, because we've had pointy sticks and fire for a pretty long time, and we've done things like get on the backs of other animals, and we figured out how to put a string on a stick and launch other pointy sticks at things from a distance. And eventually we started making gunpowder, et cetera, farming, walls. Predation has not been a threat to humans to nearly the same extent as famine. So it's probably not surprising that we're quite good at defending against weight loss, but we're not great at defending against weight gain. And once we got society to the point where there was affordable, accessible energy available on every corner, one for the border, choose your favorite, fast food restaurant. It's available at a low price. You can get 1,000 calories and you can eat it in a few minutes. That we now have the obesity epidemic. You could see that as an unfortunate consequence of successful food availability at affordable costs, at least in industrialized nations, right? So anyway, hence the obesity epidemic. So now we have to discard the original set point model because it doesn't explain that. And the model which probably best explains it, and there's a great review paper by Speakman, if people really want to dig into this and see all the proposed models that are out there, is what's called the dual intervention model. And it's basically saying, well, it's not just one point, it's two. There's a point called our upper and our point called our lower intervention points, hence the dual intervention point. Meaning that there's a point where if you gain a certain amount of weight, if you go high enough in body weight, we'll start to see physiological responses. And also there's that lower point. And there's also data to suggest that people are better or worse at defending these points, and that we have thrifty or spendthrift metabolic phenotypes. But pretty much everybody is pretty good at defending against that lower set point just because of us being humans. But anyway, now this starts to actually comport. And it makes sense when we were at a point in society where there's not an obesity epidemic, that these 2 points, we wouldn't really see that they were that different from one another. You know, if you try to increase your calories a whole lot in, you know, earlier points in human history, you'd be eating a whole lot of pretty satiating foods, and you'd have to be very active to get that food, right? But now you don't have to do those things, and we see what we see in society. So now we can start to see, oh, in humans at least, especially in this modern food environment, there's a pretty big difference, and it takes a lot of weight gain before someone starts to really see a barrier that is physiologically driven, that is strong enough to overcome those environmental signals. So the lower end, though, still stays pretty robust. We've got a huge dieting industry, really hasn't slowed the obesity epidemic much that we can tell. So anyway, this kind of comports with what we see in the real world and the evidence, where this leptin signal doesn't seem to be great at defending against weight gain, but does against weight loss. And it helps us understand that there are multiple things that go into play. But it's not to say that it's the only thing that goes into play. So that whole zone between your upper and lower intervention point is impacted primarily by environment, hence the obesity epidemic, right? So if we've got a big distance between the two as humans, that means if we're in an environment that encourages a calorie surplus, we're going to be floating around near to our upper intervention point. And it is a slow progress toward that point. If you look at some data, the average American is gaining maybe 1 or 2 pounds a year. And that kind of gets to a certain point. It does actually start to plateau for most people, but not all. So likewise, if you try to lose weight and you go back into the same less controlled environment, weight regain is very common in most people who try to lose weight. So it comports with everything. And if you try to get too lean, you're also going to gain that weight back. So there's this less regulated physiologically and more regulated zone. In the center, environmental things are largely what's going to impact someone's quote unquote set point. And then above and below your intervention points, that's when you're going to get a more robust physiological response. But it's not like there's no environmental pressures above, or that the environmental pressures, it's this threshold and all of a sudden the physiology turns on. It's more of a conceptual model where you think of kind of these 3 zones. But it really has more to do with understanding that there's a range where we can probably hang out that is largely dictated by environment. And there's these ranges that are very challenging to get into without being driven back towards that more regulated zone that are above or below our upper or lower intervention points, respectively.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So basically, you know, when there's probably that range in there that it's easier to stay at, and once you slowly get to one end or the other, it's like it's going to be a little bit tougher. But the environment plays a big role. And again, this is kind of just a general, we don't know for sure, but probably in our modern environment, we're leaning more towards the higher end of things right now, just because of, again, you know, the easy access to food and whatnot. So is this more dependent on, is it body fat or weight, or are they both kind of play a role here in that?
It's largely body fat as far as we understand it. You know, so the far and away the variable that impacts like your circulating leptin levels is body fat. There was one study that was done on nearly 300 people, ranging from relatively lean to people with class 1 obesity, and there was like a 0.85 correlation between levels of body fat percentage and circulating leptin levels. And this is people at maintenance calories, so they're not intentionally dieting or in a surplus or anything like that. So that's explaining like 70% of the variation. So it's not to say that there aren't you know, changes in leptin that are not related to body fat, because in fact it's true. Like if right now, if either one of us just fasted completely, if it was only explained by body fat, we'd expect our leptin levels to not change at all, because we'd only be losing a little bit of body fat in a given day. It's just not enough time. But what actually happens is, as soon as there seems to be the signals that will tell us that our body is in a deficit, adipose tissue starts secreting less leptin. So it's this preemptive response. And there's also leptin produced in the gastrointestinal tract, so gastric leptin that might be a little more related to the short-term signaling. So yeah, body fat is a regulator, but so is energy intake. And there are, like, those are overlapping effects, and they both have those centrally mediated effects on the hypothalamus. So if you look at the research on low energy availability, which is basically providing too low of calories for physiological function after taking into account activity, and there's research on this and where these thresholds might be, you start to see negative physiological symptoms in athletes or exercisers if they're eating too low of calories. So you can have someone who's actually at energy balance, but not eating enough for their current level of activity. This is something you might see in an endurance athlete, and they're experiencing symptoms that we would associate with dieting. And that's what's called relative energy deficiency syndrome, or relative energy deficiency in sport, rather, I should say. And that's from just not consuming enough. So if, let's say you're an endurance athlete, you're reasonably lean, you walk around, you're fine, life is good, but you're pretty far from a race, and you're consuming 3,000 calories, and that's really all you feel like you can get in comfortably with your day. Let's say you're a 120-pound woman who runs marathons, and now you start ramping up your training volume in preparation for a marathon, and now you're burning far more calories, but you're still only eating 3,000. You're going to start to see some metabolic downregulation. You lose a little bit of weight, and now you're maintaining at 5 pounds lighter, but you're still eating 3,000 calories. But you're experiencing these symptoms like you're still in a deficit, and that's because there's this mismatch. You're not consuming enough relative to how high your energy output is to maintain all the same levels of physiological function. You start to see amenorrhea in women. You start to see more frequent illness, downregulation of the immune function. You start to see drops in blood pressure, heart rate, things like that. You start to see sleep disruption, all the things that we typically associate with, being really lean are also associated with not eating enough. So there's these kind of overlapping layers. So you can take someone with obesity and crash diet them, and they will feel like crap. Or you can take someone and get them really, really lean, and then not let them regain that fat mass, and they'll experience the same thing, because they just can never get those circulating leptin levels back to change those signals from the hypothalamus in either case.
Yeah, so it's kind of two different things at play here. Like you said, it's energy availability that's going to play a role in it. How much, again, if you're exercising a ton and you're not eating enough, that's going to play a role. Or if you're just in a deficit, and then obviously this body fat set point is going to be another thing that your overall body fat level is going to play a role in this too. So again, the leaner you are, the less energy you're eating, the more you're going to, I guess, experience a lot of these things. They're going to cause you to basically defend your weight and body fat at that point.
Yeah, I think a good visual and this is a podcast, so people aren't going to see my little hand air figures, but I'll try to paint a picture verbally, is that, your circulating leptin levels are going to be the thing that has the effect on the hypothalamus that dictates whether it's going to be sending, signals to downregulate processes in your body, right? So each time you eat, you get a little leptin bump. Fantastic. If you're super, super lean, that bump is transient, right? And you're only getting as many meal sessions as you have to bring that up. But the net amount of leptin that's produced, your typical circulating levels are going to be too low to have those functioning levels of physiology. Leptin levels are going to be too low most of the day. Likewise, if your adipose tissue is pretty high, let's say you're someone with obesity, but you go on like an 800 calorie liquid diet, you're just going to have that initial drop, and your circulating leptin levels are still going to go down because they kind of act in a preemptive way, and it'll be sufficient to start to have those effects. And you can get a compounded effect if you're a lean person going on a crash diet, right? And this has been demonstrated. So there's some great work by Ann Lukes, who took women with obesity and put them on like a fasting diet. So very, very low calories, and they start to show signs of disrupted LH pulsatility. So LH is luteinizing hormone. That's the initial kind of hormone that then bifurcates into other hormones, but it dictates basically menstrual function in women. And when it starts to lose its typical pulsatility, that's when you get oligomenorrhea or menorrhea. So the disrupted frequency of menstrual cycles in the first word, oligomenorrhea, or the complete cessation of them, exercise or diet induced amenorrhea, where they're not having a menstrual cycle at all. And that's just one of the things. And it's easier to see in women because they have a menstrual cycle. But in men, they obviously wouldn't know if their menstrual cycle was disrupted, but they would probably be having suppressed testosterone levels, and that would be lower. And we see this in most of the case studies on males and case series on male physique athletes, that at certain points in contest preparation, you sometimes see precipitous drops in testosterone. I've seen as low as 1/5 of baseline. And so that's just an example of one of the many spokes on the wheel of how the hypothalamus can impact physiology. But ultimately, the signaling mechanism is the same, whether you're eating insufficient calories to maintain sufficient leptin levels, or whether your body fat is too low to allow, even when you are eating enough for energy balance, for it to be high enough energy availability. So both of these factors can be at play, which is why most people can't stay shredded. There are lower, you can hang around your lower intervention point. And if you modify the environment substantially, you can see that at the societal level. There's a pretty cool study in the mid 2000s by Bassett, where they checked out the body composition of 100 people in an Amish society, where about 3/4 of the men were farmers, and they had like 18,000 steps on average per day. And the body fat percentage was like 9.4% on average. So, sometimes, I often take shots at like the fitness influencers who are like, yeah, you can maintain 10% as a dude. And I'm like, yeah, maybe if you were a farmer who got 18,000 steps and you lived in another society. But again, there's a standard deviation on that number. Some of the Amish people could not, maintain, 9% body fat, even as men. But yeah, like there's this theoretical lower intervention point is actually very challenging, to maintain unless you really overhauled your environment and you're someone who is embedded in like the fitness community and understands nutrition, and has not been sucked into one of the many, many kind of fad or crash diets, or really not even necessarily got sucked into them, but just been exposed to the fact that you work from home, occasionally you drive to work, there's donuts sitting there, you're highly sedentary, your hunger gets dysregulated, and your metabolic function gets dysregulated because you only get 2,000 steps per day. You're not satiated after meals. Yeah, it's tough. Being a person in a modern food environment is very, very different from being someone even in a post-agricultural, pre-industrial society. So yeah, but we do have we have these examples where we look at like the Amish, for example, where you start to remove just a few of these things that seem to have been one of the many factors that have led to the obesity epidemic, and all of a sudden people revert back to an older kind of lower intervention point where we probably hung out, where either by having a very high baseline activity to have a high food intake, or if you look at even pre-agricultural societies, if you look at some of the hunter-gatherer societies out there, they're also very low in body weight and very low in adipose tissue, but they're also a little malnourished. So yeah, so nonetheless, these are all compounding and overlapping signals, and it takes a pretty substantial change to environment to overcome them. And we kind of think, oh, it's easy to overcome this and create the obesity epidemic, but we don't realize just how different the environment we live in today is from even 50 years ago, let alone 200 or 2,000 years ago. So it's taken hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution societally to get to the point now where we've just obliterated kind of that or not obliterated, where we've changed from hanging around our lower intervention point, or sometimes being below it constantly, and being malnourished, to now hanging around our upper intervention point and being pushed and skirted towards even being above it at the societal level.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely something like, our bodies basically never got that update, right? And they still, still thinking we're back in the day where we didn't know when we were going to get our next food, but little does it know, it's like you said, you can go to your fast food place, not expend any energy to get it, and you can consume 1,000 calories, no problem. And so it sounds like, again, if you can change your environment, and obviously you have like the knowledge, you've maybe the experience, and like you said, you live a active life, like you can hang around that low intervention point. But again, if you're somebody that's like super, like you don't move, you don't have any, like you said, you're eating like mostly processed food, for you, it's going to be much tougher to maintain that lower intervention point. Real quick, last question on this. Genetics, I'm sure that plays a role. I'm assuming that probably plays a role in like also that where like some people just naturally can hang out at that point that's lower and theirs is lower than somebody else. But also, does this change over time, or is it pretty much like this is what it is going to be for somebody, or can you change it over time?
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that there are individual differences that are probably largely genetic, although they may have epigenetic factors or other things that have changed them. I do think, unfortunately, you can bump up your upper intervention point relatively easy in our modern environment, gaining fat cells. The whole reason why leptin levels are high in people with obesity and it not necessarily fixing that issue for them is something akin to insulin resistance in people with diabetes, type 2 diabetes. It's hypothesized to be leptin resistance. It's not exerting the same effect. So anyway, you probably can alter your upper intervention point. Someone with childhood obesity, for example, is in a rough spot. You look at people with who grew up with more numbers of people with obesity in their family, increases their likelihood of later. And that's probably not just behavioral. There are probably epigenetic factors and then impacts of going through puberty at a very high body weight and even in childhood and perhaps even gestationally. So there's a lot of things that can change it, but that we don't necessarily have agency over. So that's one of the myths that I think is important for people to understand is that it's not like genetics are unmodifiable and everything else is. There's a lot of things outside of genetics that are more or less heritable that you could say that aren't genetic. So people in a rough spot at the point when they finally go, oh man, like this is something I got to do about it. There's a lot of things that have happened that they don't have a whole lot of agency over, unfortunately. That's not to say it's a hopeless endeavor, but yeah, there's huge individual differences. So where your lower intervention point might be could be far lower or far higher than someone else's, right? How much the environment impacts you also is something that is incredibly different between individuals. People have different satiety experiences, right? Some people see large and quick down regulations in their total energy expenditure when they go into a deficit. And some people don't. That's the difference between your thrifty and spendthrift metabolism. So someone's NEAT might drop a lot or it might stay roughly the same, NEAT being their non-exercise activity energy output or thermogenesis. So it's very difficult to predict where someone can hang out, but we can predict that if they modify the environment, they can hang out lower or higher for them. But the problem is people don't engage with standard deviations. They engage with fitness influencers, right? So and the quote unquote cream rises to the top on social media. The person who's lean all the time is going to be the person who's telling you how to get lean, and they probably really have very little to tell someone who struggled with obesity their whole life when they've been lean their whole life, right? So anyway, there are a lot of things you can do. If you look into the research that examines successful weight loss maintenance and what are these people doing that is different to people who have not been able to successfully maintain weight loss, it's a long-term commitment to high levels of physical activity. That's one of the biggest pieces and most consistently shown. Changes in lifestyle that allow them to exert some level of restraint, not necessarily rigid restraint or an unhealthy level of restraint that causes disordered eating patterns, but the ability to resist some of the environmental pressures to eat those high calorie, easy access meals on a regular basis. So people who are good at modifying their environment and changing their lifestyle and probably substantial changes in identity. When we look at some of the actual interventions that are more successful with weight loss maintenance long-term, things like acceptance-based therapy. So where instead of just like being told to eat less and try to control things, and that's a very big generalization, learning to do things like accepting the fact that you'll be a little hungry sometimes, that you won't get to eat the same things, and finding relative amount of peace with that, if you will. And then also having social support and high frequency contact with people to support you. That's another key attribute. So changing your environment includes your social environment. That means having people who are going to support you in this, so that at times when you are potentially going to have a weight gain or relapse, you might be able to borrow a little bit of support and accountability from people. So there's a lot that goes into, those are all considered environmental changes, by the way, in this model. It's not just like, does there smog outside, or are you in a food desert? Of course, those things might come into play, like how walkable is your city and things like that. But environment really does encapsulate basically everything outside of those genetics, or I should say those heritable factors. So anyway, to answer your question, with substantial modifications to your environment, people can hang out at the lower intervention point, just like we're seeing with substantial modifications to our environment in the Western industrialized world. People can hang out at a higher average body fat in society. So and how you do that on an individual basis, I think the most important thing is that you need to respect where your individual lower intervention point seems to be, and to not try to rush that process. If you're doing something that forces you to white knuckle it to maintain a certain body weight, that's probably only going to last so long. So implementing gradual behavioral changes, gradual environmental changes, and allowing yourself to hang out at a certain maintenance intake, for a while, and trying it on, not just trying to get 50 pounds off in a year and then just hope that you can keep it off. The research we have suggests that a lot of the behaviors, mindsets, and cognitions associated with weight loss are not also associated with weight maintenance. They are similar but different constructs. So you have to learn how to move into a maintenance phase. It's not as obviously goal oriented, right? There's not that constant reward of seeing the scale go down or looking better in the mirror. How do you work with the ability to rationalize these small behaviors that are only going to result in a gain of 1 or 2 pounds a year, but will eventually get you back to where you kind of look and be like, oh man, all my hard work's gone. So that is very challenging. And that's probably why even in a best case scenario, only a quarter to half of people are able to maintain 5% to 10% of their initial weight loss. And that's when we've got like people with graduate degrees checking in with you on a monthly basis, and you've gone through acceptance-based therapy and structured progressive resistance exercise, nutrition counseling, the whole 9 yards, which most people just simply don't have access to. So when you take all that stuff away, those rates drop pretty precipitously. And now we're looking at 10% of people or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. A ton of like great points in there. Like you said too, like the environment, I think people think it is just like, the food, but like you said, there's just so much more that goes into it. Like you said, social, like that plays a big role, people you hang out with. And again, just like you said, your work, what you do for that, like that's all part of your environment that people, I don't think realize. But yeah, no, we absolutely, it's, I see this with, people that come to me and work with me, or at least they are thinking about working with me. Like it's this, they've never had a problem losing it. It's maintaining that long term that seems to be the biggest problem. Like you said, people kind of just white knuckle it, and that's typically where you get yourself into trouble there with that. Was there anything else that you maybe wanted to add to this? Again, you summed it up perfectly, and I thought that was great. But I didn't know if there was anything else before we let you go here.
Yeah, no, I think the big take home message is, so this isn't just like an understanding of theory without much what do I do about it, is that you probably do have some lower and upper intervention point, but they're not where Instagram tells you they are, like 8%, 10%, 12%, 15% for a guy. I mean, even if that is a decent average figure, there's a almost as strong of a chance that you are not the average that you are the average, So I think that is something you will only be able to find out through trial and error. And if you are persistently trying to stay leaner than it seems feasible or possible, it is not just potentially an issue with you didn't try the right diet approach or the maintenance approach wasn't right. You may be just not respecting what is a reasonable amount of weight loss to be maintained. And I think a healthy focus on changing your environment and processes rather than just outcomes is really important. Eating more single ingredient food items, less processed foods, having a higher protein diet, engaging in regular resistance training, keeping a decent step count. We see typically you get out of the range where hunger gets dysregulated when you're getting at least like 6,000 or 7,000 steps per day on average. Doesn't need to be every day. And you still count the steps from exercise. So if you're lifting weights 3+ times a week, that's going to probably get you there on at least on those 3 days a week, unless you're really sedentary. But man, you'd be surprised if you take a 20-minute walk in the morning and a 20-minute walk at night. That's going to get you to 5,000 steps for most people, depending on how long your limbs are. So, that's going to get you pretty much there, even with the sedentary rest of your day, and definitely there on days when you also work out. So that might be all it takes, is a 20-minute walk in the morning, 20-minute walk in the evening, lift weights 3 times a week, and, start focusing on more satiating foods, and then changing your food environment so that you aren't constantly exposed to these hyperpalatable foods. Doesn't mean you should completely restrict yourself, because that also causes problems and recurrent binge eating. And then, focusing on those behaviors rather than outcomes, and slowly letting your weight trickle down in the same way that it slowly is trickled up. Like I said,
Yeah.
it only takes on average a 1 to 2 pound gain a year for you in your 40s or 50s to be a lot heavier than you initially intended. And the good news for people who are getting older is that when we look at actual changes to physiology in terms of metabolic rate, total daily energy expenditure, it's not until you're 60, if you stay active, that on average at the population level do we start to see energy expenditure go down. So you've got, a good solid, hopefully at least 2/3 of your life before you're running into age-related challenges, which was one of your earlier questions about, does that change over time? Does it get harder? The biggest problem is that people become less and less active throughout their life. So if people can counteract that, that is the biggest anti-aging effect that you can have. And when you control for activity levels, there's not much of a difference between someone who's 20 and 60 as far as their energy output and their ability to maintain weight.
Awesome. Excellent stuff. Is there anywhere where you would want to lead the audience, or they can find you if they're obviously not familiar? Like I said, most people probably are, but I don't know if there's anywhere else where you want to lead people to find you.
Sure, man. No, I appreciate the opportunity to be on. Great conversation. And if you want to hear me jabber my face off even more, you can follow us at Iron Culture. If you're interested specifically in competitive physique sport, you can follow me on the 3DMJ podcast, which I'm on most of the episodes, but not all of them. So we've got a big team. And then if you like reading stuff, you can head over to Stronger by Science, where I've written some articles. A good one that a lot of the stuff we touched on is an article called Can You Stay Shredded There? That was just published back in July. And for anything related to natural bodybuilding or drug-free powerlifting, check us out at 3dmusclejourney.com.
Cool. Awesome, Eric. Appreciate it so much. A ton of great information here. Looking forward to putting this out, and we'll talk to you soon.